Hi, I'm Anna from Post Me a Book. It's been a while, I think, since I um, did a post or clip on YouTube, and I had done a thumbnail that included Charlotte's Web. So I figured it's time to actually do something about that and introduce Charlotte's Web. Not only that, the sun is out, which is such a rare occasion at this time of year, or at least it feels like a rare occasion, sort of appears and then it kind of becomes grey days for eternity. Probably not eternity, feels like eternity. So I just felt okay, I felt inspired and thought I better do this post while the sun is shining. Then it's also less editing and one is more motivated. So here I am, I'm gonna do a short post, hopefully it's short, about Charlotte's Web. For those who don't know, Charlotte's Web, it is a children's book. And the reason why I wrote, and then there was Charlotte's Web, is because, or why I did a thumbnail that had, and then there was Charlotte's Web, it's because it popped into my head, and I don't really know why, but when it did pop into my head, I suddenly thought, why and how did I forget about Charlotte's Web? Because it was really one of my favorite books, absolutely. And without a doubt, it's such a sweet book. And it's one of those books when I look back, and as an adult, I would think, well, that's a book that came at the right moment, right time, right moment, because looking back on that time, I have this sense of fondness for this book that just makes it feel like it must have been something I needed to read at the time. It's not a very long book. It's probably meant for about, I don't know, 8, 7-year-old, 10s, I don't know, something like that anyway. And I think it must have been on my reading list. But anyway, Charlotte's Web. It's written by E.B. White, and it's about a pig called Wilbert, a spider called Charlotte, even a rat called Templeton, and a girl called Fern. Some might think I should start with the girl called Fern, but the book is really about Wilbert and Charlotte and the farm animals. Wilbert was a runt pig. This is the beginning of the book. And he was going to be slaughtered because he was a runt pig and there's no reason to keep a pig, feed it unnecessarily. But Fern, who was the daughter of the farmer who owned Wilbert, managed to save Wilbert and convince her dad and say, but you can't kill him. He has a right to be alive. And why should he be killed just because he was a runt? If I was a small child, would you have killed me? So anyway, she managed to convince her dad, and she got to take care of Wilbert, feed him when he was a small pig. And as he grew bigger, Fern's mum said she wasn't willing anymore to give him scraps because now he was eating more and more and more as he was growing bigger. But Fern had still decided she didn't want this pig to be killed. So her parents actually came up with an idea and said, well, take him to your uncle, who also has a farm, neighbouring farm, because he will probably take on the pig and keep on feeding him. So this is what Fern did. So Wilbert came to live on her uncle's farm instead. But Wilbert now, he had gotten so used to having Fern there all the time after school and feeding him when she came to breakfast and feeding him when she came back from school. So he got a bit lonely, and he was also put in a pen on his own. So he was really lonely. Even though Fern came after school and used to take him in her pram, her doll's pram, and go for walks with him, it came that Wilbert grew bigger and bigger and couldn't fit in the pram anymore. And even Fern, although she came, she used to just sit on a pail because now she couldn't really go out with him because he was so big, so he was kept penned up. However, what we do discover, the farm animals, they do talk to each other, but the other animals weren't quite willing to be Wilbert's friends. They all felt they were too busy. The lambs, well, they thought he was more lowly than any of the other animals and they weren't going to play around with a pig. And other animals didn't have time. The goose used to talk to Wilbert and at one point managed to get him to escape. She encouraged him to escape, and he did do that. The owners of the farm managed to get Wilbert back into his pen by enticing him with food, because by the time he had run around quite a bit and escaped, he was so hungry that whatever anyone said, he was not willing to keep on running on an empty stomach. So they managed to entice him back in his pen. He was still lonely again. And then one day he heard a little voice and he wondered, where's this voice coming from? And then he looked at the top of the rafters, or over the door, the entrance to the barn or the pigsty. And there was a spider's web. And that was how he met Charlotte. And Charlotte, who was a spider, turned out to be Wilbert's best friend in the whole book, and turned out to be a very loyal friend. And considering she was just a spider, but she even saved Wilbert's life. So this story is about the bond between a spider and a pig, and how she encourages Wilbert throughout the time of the book, through the entirety of the book, to keep up spirits, to not feel downhearted. So she's a bit like a mother who really is just nurturing her child all the time, keeping up his spirits, saying this is going to be all right. Because at some point, Wilbert discovers that the farmer, they were just feeding him so that they could eat him at Christmas. So he becomes downhearted about this. But Charlotte says, I'll never let this happen. And Wilbert says to her, are you sure you're not going to let this happen, Charlotte? And she says, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen. And in the story, she does make sure that this doesn't happen. And she saves Wilbert's life. What I liked about this book, I think, is just the closeness of these two friends. And I think it must be the fact that she's a spider and he's a pig, and yet they got on so well, interspecies friendship, and that she really managed to save Wilbert by doing what she can. And the book is about how she saves Wilbert by writing words in her web so that the people could read the words. Like she wrote terrific, and she wrote a humble pig in her spider's web. And every time people saw this, like the farmer came and the farmhand came and they saw this and they thought it was a miracle. So each time they saw this, they just then postponed the idea that they were going to fatten Wilbert just to eat him, because they thought, well, we can't kill this miracle. At some point, when all this writing kept on going on, it started drawing crowds and tourists who also wanted to see Charlotte's Web, where it was written terrific and fantastic or whatever it was, or radiant. As time went on, then the crowds died down, and so the threat of killing Wilbert was always hanging over him. So Charlotte came up with a plan, and the plan was they would take Wilbert to the fair, which came every year. The farmer would take Wilbert to the fair, because they normally took their pigs, and Wilbert was now quite a big pig, so they were hoping that if they took him to the fair, he would win a prize. So when Wilbert comes to the fair, Charlotte actually follows. In the beginning, she wasn't going to follow because she was getting quite tired. What we don't know, what Wilbert doesn't know, is that Charlotte is getting, well, older. She's close to dying. But she was also going to lay her eggs, so she was also tired because of that. And at first she said, no, I haven't got the energy to follow. But in the end, she is convinced and she does decide to follow them. And because of this, she manages to save Wilbert's life, because she writes a very last thing that she does, or one of the very last things she does, is write humble in her spider's web in the pen that Wilbert was in at the fair. And people managed to see this. He didn't win first prize for being the biggest pig, but he won an honorary prize because of all these words that Charlotte had written. And that was one of the last things that Charlotte actually did. She also said to Wilbert, Wilbur, I should say, his name is actually Wilbur, not Wilbert. She also said to Wilbur that this is the last thing I'm ever going to do. And Wilbur asked her, but why? And she said, because I'm going to die. And she does die, but she also, before she dies, she lays eggs in a sack. And what turns out is that Wilbur carries these eggs to the farm, and he sets them somewhere where they're not going to hatch till next spring. Charlotte dies, but she manages to carry on her heritage with her newborn that come out at spring. It is such a sweet book. And I do think it is this interrelationship between the pig and And a spider. Who would have thought a small spider, because Charlotte was a small spider, could save a pig? Who would have thought a spider would want to save a pig? I mean, I know this is a children's book, but for me, it was a very nice book. I had tried to find this book to borrow it because I figured it was such a long time since I read it, so I really wanted to check out and see if it really was what I remember it being. And I had seen the film, but that was also a long time ago. But here, it's not so easy to borrow English books, and I couldn't borrow it as an ebook. It wasn't available. But I did manage to get an audiobook, and I was listening to this audiobook, and there were some things I discovered, which again, I'm always surprised when I suddenly discover it. There's some assumptions that I had. I had always assumed that E.B. White was a woman. And then I discovered E.B. White was not a woman, because this audiobook was actually read by E.B. White. So I discovered he was a man. And I'd always assumed that E.B. White was a woman and a British woman. But I discovered no, it was a man and he was American. Because all the time I'd read Charlotte's Web, I'd read it with an English accent in my head and a woman's voice. So I discovered these two things and I thought, no, this is not going to be good. One, it's a man. Two, he's reading it with an American accent. But I have to say, E.B. White actually did do his book justice. I have to say he did actually read the book very, very well. I'm well impressed, because you just come into the book, and albeit I like reading books myself, sometimes if you find the right person who's reading the book, then you completely forget that, yep, I wanted to read this myself, because they read it in the way that you yourself sometimes imagined it, albeit not quite in this instance. But his characters, because they are his characters, they came out the way that I remember them. And he read his book very well. We have an afterword from another person at the end of this book who said that when they made the film, the one thing E.B. White said to them, they were not to change the ending, because, as I said, Charlotte dies, and this book it's a children's book, so sometimes you don't always want to bring up the subject of death with young children. But E.B. White was so decided that this should not end, this should not be changed. And the book was, the film, it did actually stick to that. And in this afterward, the man who spoke about the film, he said, E.B. White had said when he saw the film, there are certain things that changed, but and he expected that, but at least they kept the ending. And I do understand this. I think for me, I wasn't particularly overwrought about the ending. I still find it very, very sad, because even when I read it, sad ending like Charlotte, her dying, I still find it sad. And I'm sure I did as a child. So I'm not surprised that sometimes you think these things should not be brought up for children just at some point. But death is there, so that it depends how you bring it up, I guess, and how you allow children to talk about it. So I am still happy that the fondness for Charlotte's Web is still there, and I still remember it as it was, and it is still such a sweet book. Until next time, thank you for listening. At least the sun is still out, so I can go to work with a happy face. Thank you and bye.